There is no blue in a blue eye, not a drop. Cut one open and search it, and you will find brown, or you will find nothing at all. The blue is not in there. If your eyes are blue, you have spent your whole life being told you have a color that you do not actually own. What people see when they look at you is not a pigment, it is light coming back out. So here is the problem that starts everything. If there is no blue substance, then blue eyes cannot be passed down the way a color is passed down. Something else is being inherited. Something that is not a color at all. And whatever that something is, it did not happen 100 times in 100 places. Blue-eyed people in Denmark, in Turkey, and in Jordan carry the same stretch of DNA around it. The same one. Populations that have been apart for thousands of years, holding an identical piece. There is only one thing that can mean. Somewhere, at some point, there was a first person. How we can say that out loud without guessing is the part I want to get to. Start with what an eye actually is. The colored ring is called the iris, and it is not a flat disk of paint. Sarah, what is actually in there?
Tissue, mostly. It is a layer with a fine mesh inside it, and behind that mesh sits a dark backing. Think of the iris as a cloudy layer stretched over a dark wall. In a brown eye, the front of that layer is packed with melanin, so light goes in and gets absorbed, and brown is what bounces back. In a blue eye, that front layer has very little melanin in it, so the light goes deeper, hits the mesh, and scatters. Short wavelengths scatter the most. Short wavelengths are blue. That is the whole trick, Tom.
Wait, so it is the same reason the sky is blue?
Exactly the same. There is no blue paint over your head either. There is air, and there is light bouncing around in it. Your iris is doing the smaller version of that.
Which reframes the entire question. Blue eyes are not a color that got added. They are a color that shows up when something else is missing. Take enough melanin out of the front of the iris, and blue arrives on its own, for free, out of physics. And that changes what has to be inherited. Nobody is passing down blue. What gets passed down is an instruction about how much melanin to put in that layer. Turn the instruction down far enough, and the blue appears. So the search stops being a search for a color gene. It becomes a search for a dimmer switch. They found it. And it is not where you would expect, because it is not inside the gene that makes the pigment. Peter, if the switch is not in the pigment gene, then where is it?
Next door, Tom. The gene that helps build melanin is called OCA2. The switch is not in OCA2. It sits in a neighboring gene called HERC2, in a stretch that acts as a control dial for OCA2. So HERC2 is not making anything you can see. It is telling OCA2 how loud to play. Turn that dial down. Less melanin goes into the iris, and the eye reads as blue. And here is the part that gets people. Most of the difference between a brown eye and a blue eye comes down to a single base pair. One letter.
One letter.
1. Everything else about the eye is unchanged. The tissue is the same, the mesh is the same, the dark wall behind it is the same. One letter turns the dial down, and the physics does the rest.
So now we have a mechanism, and a mechanism can be traced. Because if blue eyes come from one specific letter in one specific place, you can go and look at who is carrying it. That is what a team at the University of Copenhagen did, led by a researcher called Hans Eiberg, and they published it in 2008. They did not only check whether blue-eyed people had the change, that would tell you almost nothing. Of course they have it. They looked at the DNA sitting around it. And that distinction is everything, so let me be clear about why. When a change appears in a person, it does not appear alone. It appears sitting inside a run of DNA, with particular neighbors on either side. Those neighbors travel with it, as a block, down the generations, which means the block is a signature. It says where the change came from. If the same change had happened independently in different places, each of those events would be sitting in its own block, with its own neighbors. Different families, different surroundings. You would see several signatures. Peter, so what did they actually see?
One signature. They looked at blue-eyed people in Denmark, and then in Turkey, and then in Jordan. Not neighbors, not one population that recently split. Those groups have been separated by enormous distances and enormous stretches of time, and every one of them carried the same run of markers around the switch. The same block, intact. There is no gentle way to read that. When a piece of DNA is that uniform across groups that far apart, it did not arise over and over. It arose once. Once meaning in one person. In one person.
That is the sentence, and it deserves a second, because it is easy to hear it as a figure of speech, and it is not one. It is the conclusion the data forces. Every person alive today with ordinary inherited blue eyes is carrying a change that started in a single human being. Not a tribe, not a region, not a slow drift across a continent. One individual in whom the dial got turned down and who then had children. We can even put them in time, and the block is what allows it. Peter, how do you get a date out of a piece of DNA?
You measure how long it still is, Tom. Every generation, the blocks get chopped and reshuffled a little when a parent passes DNA on. So a block only ever gets shorter. That makes it a clock that runs one way. A change that happened a very long time ago sits in a short, chewed-up block because it has been through thousands of rounds of shuffling. A recent one is still sitting in a long, intact run. And this block is long. It has not been cut down much at all, so this is not ancient. This is close.
How close?
Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago.
6 to 10,000. That is close. That is uncomfortably close. 6,000 years ago, there were already towns. There was farming. There were people keeping records of grain. This is not some fog at the beginning of the species. This is well inside the part of the story where humans were already recognizably us. And we know nothing else about them. Not their name, not their sex, not where they stood when it happened. We know they existed with more certainty than we know almost anything about any specific person from that era, and we cannot say a single other thing about them. Sarah, is this why a baby's eyes can change?
It is, and it is the same mechanism running late. A lot of babies are born with very little melanin in the front of the iris, so they scatter light and look blue. Then, over the first months, the melanin gets laid down. If the instruction says put plenty in, the eyes turn. If it says do not, they stay. Nothing is repainted, Tom. The dial is just still moving.
So the color is not settled at birth.
Not for everyone. You are watching a setting arrive.
Which is a good place to be honest about the limits of this. Eye color is not one gene with one answer. HERC2 and OCA2 explain the large split, the brown and the blue. They do not explain everything. Green and hazel are messier, they involve more than one contribution, and they are not simply a halfway point between the two. So this is not a story about a gene for eye color. There is no such thing. It is a story about one dial, one letter, and one very large consequence. And the consequence is the strangest part of it. Most of the ways we connect to the deep past are group-sized. A migration, a population, a people who moved from here to there. The evidence is real, but the subject is a crowd, and a crowd is easy to keep at arm's length. This is not crowd-sized. If your eyes are blue, there is a specific individual at the end of that line, not a metaphor for an ancestor. An actual person with a face who was born and who lived and who did not know that anything unusual had happened. They looked at their children with the same eyes you have, and every blue-eyed person you have ever met or been annoyed by or stood behind in a queue is holding the other end of the same thread.